stuck at work, baby. Happy 10th anniversary. That text buzzed in my hand at 7:43 p.m. while I sat 2 tables away watching my husband kiss my best friend. I did not breathe. 10 years of marriage, 22 years of friendship, and $340,000 of my savings sitting in accounts that bore his name. All of it meaningless to him. But the moment I pushed back my chair to walk over there, a stranger gripped my arm and said, "Stay calm. The real show is about to start." My name is Clara Whitmore, and I am 67 years old. I say that so you understand what I mean when I tell you I did not panic that night. I have lived too long and worked too hard to panic. Panic is a luxury I surrendered somewhere around my 41st year, the year my first husband Raymond died of a heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and I drove home to tell our 2 sons, Daniel, who was 14, and Marcus, who was 10, that the world had changed for us permanently. I raised those boys alone, on a hospital administrator's salary, in a 4-bedroom house in Claremont, Ohio that I had paid for with 15 years of careful saving and zero self-pity. I worked for 35 years at Claremont Regional Medical Center, eventually running the administrative department for the entire hospital system. I knew how to organize. I knew how to document. I knew how to move through a crisis without letting a single person in the room see you sweat. By the time I retired at 62, I had $340,000 in a retirement account I had built contribution by contribution, year by year, through every market correction and every personal hardship. I owned my house outright. I had no debt. I had 2 grown sons who were decent men. I was, by any honest measure, a woman who had built something real from the ground up. And I was proud of it, in the quiet way that people are proud of things they never boasted about. I met Richard Whitmore 2 weeks before my 57th birthday at a charity auction benefiting the children's wing of the hospital where I had worked my entire career. He was tall, silver-haired, easy laughing, and he bid on a weekend getaway package just to outbid me, which I found either obnoxious or charming, depending on how much wine I had consumed. He introduced himself afterward, and we talked for 45 minutes without noticing the room emptying around us. It was Sandra who introduced us formally. Sandra Gale, my closest friend since we were both 22-year-old girls navigating our first professional jobs, sitting side by side in an orientation session and bonding immediately over the fact that we were the only 2 women in the room who had brought their own lunch. 22 years of friendship. 22 years of secrets shared, of funerals attended together, of children raised in parallel, of phone calls that started with, "I need to tell you something," and ended an hour later with both of us laughing. Sandra introduced Richard and me, and I thought nothing of it except gratitude. He was in real estate. He had a warm handshake and a way of listening that made you feel you were the most interesting person in any room. We dated for 14 months before he proposed, and I said yes because I was 57 years old, and I knew the difference between loneliness dressed up as contentment and real happiness. He moved into my house. We married on a Saturday in September with my sons and my grandchildren present. I put $180,000 of my retirement savings into a joint account because I believed in building something together. That is the kind of woman I was. I believed in building. I should have looked more carefully at what he was building while I wasn't watching. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Not that he had one. Everyone has a phone. But the way it began to travel with him. It left the kitchen counter. It left the coffee table. It went everywhere he went, face down or face to his chest, tucked like a small secret in the palm of his hand. I am a detail person. I spent 35 years ensuring that a hospital ran efficiently, which means I spent 35 years noticing things that were out of place. A missing supply requisition, a scheduling gap, a pattern where there should be none. The phone was a pattern. Then there were the evenings. Richard had always kept irregular hours. Real estate does not respect a 9-to-5 schedule, and I had never begrudged him that. But the irregular hours began to shift. Client dinners on Fridays, a property showing that ran until 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, a networking event I was never invited to attend. Each one, individually, was explainable. Together, they formed a shape. The shape was absence. Deliberate, scheduled, consistent absence, dressed in the clothes of professional obligation. The third thing was Sandra. I noticed it slowly, the way you notice a temperature dropping, not the moment it begins, but when you are already cold. Sandra had been in our house every other week for the first 7 years of my marriage to Richard. She had her own mug in my cabinet. She knew where I kept the good coffee. She had laughed at Richard's jokes, and he had laughed at hers, and I had loved watching two of my favorite people get along so easily. But around what I later calculated was 18 months before that anniversary dinner, the visits thinned. She started canceling our standing Saturday lunches. Once, twice, 5 times in a row. When I called, she answered, but her voice had a texture to it I had not heard before. Tight. Careful. As though she was measuring every word before she released it. Sandra Gale, who had spent 22 years being entirely incapable of measuring her words, was suddenly speaking to me like a diplomat. I told myself it was stress. Her marriage to David had always been complicated. She and David Gale had been together for 26 years, a long, grinding relationship that had produced 3 children and 1 sustained negotiation about who was unhappier. I gave her the grace of an explanation I half believed. Then, on an ordinary Wednesday evening in March, Richard came home from a showing and hung his jacket on the back of the kitchen chair. And as he bent to kiss my cheek, I caught it. A scent. Subtle. Barely there, but specific. I knew that fragrance the way you know your own handwriting. Rose and amber and something underneath that smelled like memory. I had given Sandra that perfume for her 54th birthday. I had bought it myself at a department store in Columbus, and I had thought of her when I bought it because it was sophisticated and a little unusual, and those 2 words had always described Sandra Gale. I excused myself to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and I breathed very carefully for about 2 minutes. And then I made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a decision made in anger. A quiet decision, the kind that comes from a very deep and very certain place. The kind of decision I had been training for my entire life without knowing it. I was not going to say one word to Richard. I was going to find out exactly what was happening, and exactly what he had done with my money, and exactly how far this went. And then I was going to act with the full weight of everything I knew. Because that is what 35 years of running a hospital system teaches you. You do not act on suspicion. You act on evidence. Suspicion makes you emotional. Evidence makes you powerful. I made 2 phone calls the following morning. Both from my personal cell phone, both made while Richard was out showing a property. The first was to Patricia Holt, a family law attorney whose name had been given to me 3 years earlier by a colleague who had gone through a difficult divorce and described Patricia as the calmest and most terrifying woman in any courtroom. The second call was to Frank Hollis. I had found Frank through an online directory of licensed private investigators in Ohio. His reviews were brief and professional. No dramatics, no promises, just phrases like thorough, discreet, and exactly what I needed. I left him a voicemail with my first name and my personal number, and he called back within 2 hours. His voice was unhurried, a little graveled. The voice of a man somewhere in his late 50s who had long since run out of patience for anything unnecessary. I told him I believed my husband was having an affair, and that I suspected there was also financial irregularity in our joint account. I told him I did not want confrontation. I wanted documentation. I don't do confrontation, he said. I do facts. I'll take your case. We arranged a meeting, a coffee shop 15 miles from my neighborhood, a Tuesday morning, a table in the back corner. Frank Hollis turned out to be a compact, quiet man with gray eyes and the habit of sitting with his back to the wall. He had a yellow legal pad and he listened to everything I said without once interrupting. When I finished, he looked at his pad and said, "This is a 6 to 8 week job minimum. You want the affair documented. You want the financials reviewed. You want a full picture." "I want the full picture," I said. "Good," he said. "People who want the full picture make my job easier. People who want to blow it up halfway through make my job harder." "I'm not interested in blowing anything up halfway through," I told him. He looked at me for a moment and then wrote something on his yellow pad. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think you are. I want you to understand who Dottie Pearson is, because she matters in this story and she deserves to be properly introduced. Dorothy Pearson, age 72, has lived 3 houses down from me for 19 years. Her husband, Judge Harold Pearson, passed 7 years ago. Dottie was a legal secretary for 30 years before that, and she knows the law the way I know a hospital budget. Not theoretically, but by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated understanding of someone who has watched it operate up close for decades. She is small, silver-haired, and she bakes coffee cake every Sunday morning, which she brings to my door whether I ask for it or not. She is the kind of friend who does not offer opinions until you ask for them, and when you do ask, she tells you the truth. I told Dottie everything on a Thursday evening in late March. We sat in her kitchen with decaf coffee and slices of her coffee cake, and I laid it out. The perfume, the phone, Sandra's absence, the irregular evenings. Dottie listened without moving. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup and said, "You've already called Patricia Holt, haven't you?" I told her I had. "Good girl," she said. "Now let Patricia do her job and let yourself do yours, which is to keep living your life exactly as it appears. Nothing changes on the surface. You understand?" I told her I understood. "He cannot know, you know," she said. The moment he knows, you know, everything you have gets complicated. You protect yourself quietly, and then you choose your moment. I chose my moment. It took 8 weeks and 4 days. What Frank uncovered over those 8 weeks was, in its way, not surprising. But it was specific enough to be devastating, and specificity is what matters when you are building a case. He documented 14 meetings between Richard and Sandra Gale at various locations across a 40-mile radius. Restaurants, hotels, once at a rental property that Richard managed through his real estate business. The affair had been running for approximately 19 months. Not 18, 19. Which meant it had begun when Sandra and I were still having our Saturday lunches regularly. Which meant she had been sitting across from me with coffee in her hand and my perfume on her neck and looking me in the eye every 2 weeks. I filed that fact away without commenting on it, even to myself, because I had decided not to spend a single unit of my energy on feelings that were not useful. The financial picture was more complicated and, ultimately, more actionable. Richard had been writing off personal expenses through his real estate business. Hotel stays, dinners, one weekend in Pittsburgh that I now understood was not a property conference, as business deductions. Some of these expenses had been run through our joint account before being transferred. Patricia estimated that over 19 months, approximately $22,400 had moved from our joint account in a pattern consistent with concealment. It was not a fortune. It was enough. It was enough to establish a pattern of financial dishonesty in the marriage, which in Ohio law carries specific consequences. Patricia also discovered that Richard had consulted his own attorney 6 weeks earlier. He was preparing to file for divorce. He had been restructuring his business assets quietly, moving equity in 2 commercial listings into a separate LLC registered in his daughter's name from his first marriage. A daughter I had met twice and never thought about. The strategy was transparent to Patricia. He intended to claim minimal personal assets at the time of divorce, leaving me. Or so he imagined, fighting for a fraction of what I had put in. He had been planning to leave. He had been planning the exit even as he texted me happy anniversary messages from across the restaurant. I want to be precise about what I felt when Patricia laid this out for me. It was not grief. Grief had come and gone in the first week, those early March nights when I lay in the dark next to Richard and stared at the ceiling and felt the shape of a marriage dissolving under my hands. That grief was real, and I let it be real, and then I set it aside. What I felt in Patricia's office was something colder and cleaner. Clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes from knowing exactly where you stand and exactly what is coming. Patricia had filed a formal separation of my personal assets under Ohio law, quietly and correctly, 11 days earlier. My $160,000 personal retirement savings, the portion that had never entered the joint account, were already retitled in an account that bore only my name. The house, which I had owned before the marriage and which remained in my name on the deed, was protected. She had drafted a response to whatever Richard's attorney was preparing that would make it clear his LLC maneuver would not survive discovery. The $22,400 he had moved would be addressed. The documentation Frank had gathered on the affair would be admitted as relevant to the financial concealment pattern. I was not going to walk away empty-handed. I was not going to be surprised. Now, about the restaurant. This part I need to tell you carefully, because it is the part that required me to understand things in a particular order. 2 weeks before our anniversary, Richard came to me with a suggestion. He wanted to try a new Italian restaurant downtown, La Stellina on Meridian Avenue, for our anniversary dinner. He had heard about it from a client, he said. Supposed to be excellent. He was very enthusiastic about it in the easy, performed way that people are enthusiastic about things when they are performing enthusiasm rather than feeling it. I agreed without comment and made a reservation online for 2 at 7 p.m. What I did not know then, what Frank told me only 4 days before the dinner, was that Richard and Sandra had been meeting at La Stellina every single Friday evening for the past 4 months. It was their place. Richard had suggested it for our anniversary because he was either extraordinarily careless or, and I suspect this is the truth, because some part of him had stopped caring enough to be careful. When Frank told me this on the phone, there was a silence between us. "Do you want to change the reservation?" he asked. "No," I said. Another silence. Then Frank said, "I'll be there." I did not ask him what he meant by that. I should have asked. I understand now that Frank had already been in contact with David Gale, Sandra's husband, for approximately a week at that point. David had been brought into the picture because Frank believed he had a right to know. Frank operates on a principle I later came to appreciate deeply, which is that information belongs to the people it affects. Frank had told David. David had taken it, from what Frank later described to me, with a very specific and quiet fury that I recognized immediately as the fury of someone who had suspected and been hoping to be wrong. Frank had also, in his methodical way, arranged for a process server to be in or near La Stellina on the evening of our anniversary. I did not know any of this when I dressed for dinner on Friday evening. I wore a navy dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I drove myself to the restaurant because Richard said he would meet me there. He had a showing that ran late. Of course he did. I arrived at 7 and was seated at my table, and I ordered sparkling water, and I sat with a menu open in my hands, and I looked across the room. There they were. I want you to feel what that moment is, not what the word betrayal sounds like in the abstract, but what it looks like in a specific room. Richard was in a gray jacket I had bought him for his birthday. Sandra was in red. She always looked beautiful in red. I had told her so 100 times. They were at a corner table with a candle between them, and he had his hand over hers, and as I sat there with my sparkling water and my grandmother's pearls, he leaned across the white tablecloth and kissed her, softly, comfortably. The way you kiss someone you have kissed many times before. My phone buzzed. I looked down. "Stuck at work, baby. Happy 10th anniversary." I read it once. I read it again. I set my phone on the table and pushed back my chair. A hand closed around my forearm. Not rough, firm, deliberate. A man was standing beside my table, someone I had not heard approach, and he leaned down so that what he said was between the two of us only. He had gray eyes and a legal pad tucked under his arm, and I realized in the same instant that this was Frank Hollis, and that I had never actually seen his face before. "Stay calm," he said. "The real show is about to start." I sat back down. Frank took the empty seat across from me, Richard's seat, and he spoke in a low, even voice. David Gale was at the bar. He had arrived 20 minutes ago, and he knew where Sandra was sitting. He had asked Frank to let things proceed naturally. He wanted to approach them himself. The process server was outside the restaurant, waiting for Frank's signal to come in. Patricia's response package had been transmitted to Richard's attorney that afternoon, meaning Richard had almost certainly already received a call from his own lawyer informing him that his financial maneuver had been identified and countered. He might or might not have read that message yet. "How are you feeling?" Frank asked me. "I'm feeling very clear," I said, and I meant it. I was the clearest I had been in 8 weeks. All the careful work, all the documentation, all the quiet long nights of planning. They had led to this room, this table, this sparkling water, and this extraordinary moment of being exactly where I had intended to be. I watched David Gale set down his glass at the bar. He is a large man, David. Not aggressive, but large, the kind of physical presence that makes a room aware of him. He walked across the restaurant floor with the slow certainty of someone who is past the point of turning back. When he reached Richard and Sandra's table, he did not raise his voice. I was watching. I could not hear everything, but I heard enough. He said Sandra's name first. Just her name, quietly. She looked up, and the color left her face so fast, it was like watching a lamp go dark. Richard looked up a half second later, and I watched his expression travel through surprise, then calculation, then a forced calmness that did not sit right on his face because he had not expected to need it yet. David sat down in the third chair at their table and began to talk. That was when I stood up. I did not rush. I carried my sparkling water with me, which I did not intend to spill on anyone, though I will not pretend the thought did not cross my mind. Frank touched my elbow lightly as I passed him, not to stop me, just a small acknowledgement, I think. I walked across the restaurant and I stood beside their table and I waited for a natural pause in whatever David was saying, which took perhaps 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, Sandra looked at me and Richard looked at me, and the gap between what they expected and what they were getting was wider than anything I could have designed. I set my phone on the table between them, face up, with the anniversary text message still on the screen. I looked at Richard first, because he was my husband of 10 years, and I believed he deserved the dignity of being addressed directly. I said, I want you to know that I am not surprised. I want you to know that I have known for 8 weeks, and that in those 8 weeks, I have worked very carefully with my attorney to protect everything that was mine before you, and to document everything that left our joint account without my knowledge. I want you to know that the LLC you registered in your daughter's name 3 weeks ago has already been flagged in discovery proceedings, and that the $22,400 will be part of the settlement discussion. I am not angry, Richard. I am disappointed in a very specific way, which is that I thought I had chosen a man with the basic integrity to end a marriage before starting another relationship, and it turns out I was wrong about that. I let that sit for a moment. Then I looked at Sandra. 22 years. Her mug in my cabinet, my perfume around her neck. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say to Sandra, and I had decided that the truest thing I could give her was very few words. I loved you like a sister, I said. That is all. She opened her mouth. I did not let her speak. I raised one hand, not sharply, just a small and final gesture, and I turned away. Richard said my name. He said it twice. The second time was louder, and a few heads in the restaurant turned. I kept walking. He pushed back his chair, and I heard him say, Clara, just let me explain. I did not turn around. He caught up to me at the door. He put his hand on my arm, the same arm Frank had held less than 15 minutes ago, though with entirely different intent. And he said, It's not what you think. Whatever you think you know, it's not. I looked at him, directly. For a long moment, I said, Richard, there is a process server outside this door. He has been waiting very patiently, and I think you should let him do his job. Then I suggest you call your attorney, who I believe has already been trying to reach you this afternoon. I am going home now. I would like you to please arrange to collect your things this weekend. Dottie Pearson will be at the house in case you need anyone present. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I walked through the door. The process server was indeed there. A young man in a dark jacket who stepped forward when he saw me confirmed Richard's name over my shoulder as Richard appeared in the doorway behind me and placed the folder in Richard's hands with a quiet and entirely professional, Sir, you've been served. I did not watch Richard's face. I walked to my car, started the engine, and sat for approximately 2 minutes in the parking lot of La Stellina on Meridian Avenue, with my grandmother's pearl earrings catching the light from the street lamp. And I took 3 long, slow breaths. Then I drove home. I will tell you what the reckoning looked like, because I think you deserve to know that it was not clean and it was not simple, and the person who surprised me most was not Richard. Richard came to the house that Saturday morning. He did not call first. He drove up at 9:30 and rang the doorbell, which I found interesting because he still had a key, and the fact that he rang the bell told me something about what had already shifted in his own understanding of where he stood. I let him in. Dottie was in the kitchen. She had arrived at 8 with coffee cake and had not offered to leave, which I appreciated. Richard sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he tried 3 different approaches in the space of 40 minutes. The first was explanation. Sandra and he had connected at a difficult time in both their marriages, and things had progressed further than they should have, and he was sorry. He used the word inappropriate twice, which is the word people use when they mean something much larger but are hoping a smaller word will contain it. The second approach was negotiation. He wanted to discuss the financials in good faith, without attorneys, just the 2 of them. I told him that good faith was something that should have been applied about 19 months earlier, and that all financial discussions would now go through Patricia Holt. The third approach was emotion. He said that he had not stopped caring about me. He said that the marriage had felt lonely to him. He said he didn't know how to tell me. That third one required me to look at him for a moment before I answered. I said, Richard, We have been married for 10 years. You could have told me at any point. You chose not to. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And I made choices too, and mine were made with better information. So let's stop talking about what you couldn't do and start talking about what happens now. He did not have another approach after that. He sat in my kitchen chair with his hands flat on my kitchen table, and he looked like what he was. A man who had planned to leave on his own terms and was now leaving on someone else's. Sandra called twice that week. I did not answer. She left one voicemail. I listened to it once, sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, a gray Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was unraveling in a way that, 8 weeks earlier, would have broken my heart entirely. She said she was sorry. She said she had made a terrible mistake. She said she didn't know how it had happened. And that, I think, was the part that told me the most. Because if you do not know how a 19-month affair with your best friend's husband happens, then you have not done the work of being honest with yourself. And I cannot carry someone else's dishonesty alongside my own grief. I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel good about it. I did not feel bad about it. I felt that it was the correct thing to do. David Gale and I spoke once, briefly, about 3 weeks after the restaurant. We met for coffee at a place neither of us usually went to, and we sat there for about 40 minutes. Two people who had been made to feel foolish by people they trusted, and we were honest with each other about what we had noticed and when we had noticed it and what we had done and not done. He was quiet and thoughtful and more dignified than I expected, because grief can go either way, and his had gone toward dignity. He told me he was filing for divorce. I told him I was as well. We finished our coffee and shook hands in the parking lot, and that was the end of that. The divorce took 9 months. Richard's attorney pushed back on the LLC, as Patricia had known he would. It did not hold. The $22,400 was addressed in the settlement. I kept the house. I kept my retirement accounts. I was awarded a portion of the marital assets that reflected a decade of shared financial life, and it was a fair portion, and I was satisfied. Richard moved to Columbus. I heard through people we had known together that he was still seeing Sandra for a time, and then that they were not together. I heard this the way you hear information about strangers, with mild acknowledgement and no real feeling. I stopped keeping track. Here's what I want to tell you now that the story is finished. Not because you asked, but because I believe it is the reason stories like this one exist. Not to entertain, though I hope I have done that, but to say something true to the person on the other side of this recording who might be sitting in the quiet of her own house tonight, wondering if what she suspects is real, wondering if she has any ground to stand on, wondering if she is too old or too tired, or too far in to start over. You are not. I was 67 years old and I started over. Not dramatically, not with a suitcase and a train ticket and a new haircut, though I did eventually get the haircut. I started over quietly, the same way I had built everything worth having in my life, carefully and specifically, and without asking anyone's permission. The house that had been our house became mine again, the way it had always been mine, and I painted the bedroom a color that Richard had always found too bold, and I put Sandra's mug in the back of the highest cabinet where I would never accidentally reach for it, and I ordered new furniture for the living room that I chose entirely by myself, and I had Dottie over every Sunday morning for coffee cake. And I called my sons and I told them what had happened, not as a tragedy, but as a fact. And they were angry on my behalf, which was kind of them. And I told them that they didn't need to be because I was fine. And I was fine. Not immediately. Not without the weeks of quiet grief that I let myself have in private, sitting in my car in parking lots and on the edge of the bathtub, and once, briefly, on my kitchen floor when a song came on the radio that Richard and I had danced to at our wedding. But fine in the larger sense. The sense that matters. The sense of a woman who knows who she is, who knows what she is worth, and who knows that the worst thing that has ever happened to her is never the last thing that will happen to her. What I learned in those 8 weeks of waiting and planning was something I already knew but had let myself forget. That information is not cruelty, and clarity is not coldness, and protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. Love that requires your silence to survive is not love. It is management. And I am 67 years old, and I have spent 35 years managing a hospital system, and I am very good at it, but I will not manage a marriage. That is not what I am here for. The stranger in the restaurant, Frank Hollis, sent me a card about 3 months after everything was settled. No letter inside. Just a card with his business card paper clipped to it, and in his precise handwriting, 4 words, good instincts, Well executed. I have it on my refrigerator. I look at it sometimes when I make my morning coffee, and it makes me smile. Not because it was a compliment, because it was an accurate description of something I already knew. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.